how do I save for my retirement? Well, I can either lend money, in which case I get excessively taxed, or I can borrow money to invest in a property, in which case I actually get a tax advantage. That's not much of a choice, really, and so that would tend to lead to middle-aged people entering the residential property market because of tax reasons. And of course that's helping to squeeze younger people out. The middle-aged people either drive up house prices, in which case it's harder for young people to afford to get into a first home, or sometimes they lower rents, in which case there's actually less incentive to buy a home.
So you've got this funny situation where more old people are living for longer in bigger houses, effectively squeezing out young people into smaller houses. They're investing their money in rental property, which is pushing up the value of rental property, making it even harder for young people to get into the market.
That's certainly what the logic suggests, and New Zealand has, the evidence is consistent with that explanation in New Zealand. Now, the work I've done is really, it's logical thinking. It's not completely evidence-based, but it is consistent with all the evidence, and I suspect the next job is to see if there is an empirical way of testing whether this mechanism that we're suggesting is really an important driving force in driving the housing trends that we've seen in New Zealand in the last 15 years.
What could be some of the policy prescriptions to get around this problem?
Of course, the problem isn't longevity, right? This is a good thing. We want people to live longer. Yep. The aspect is really, have we got a system of policies which is consistent with getting the greatest happiness out of, winning the long straw in life and living longer? There's two ways of approaching this. The first is, do we have a tax and pension system which is consistent with people getting older, living for longer? Or is the system that we've adopted in New Zealand actually going to have these unintended consequences which will just get worse? Now, my sense is that we haven't thought through the unintended consequences that increasing longevity makes it harder for younger people to get into housing and delays the time until they get the appropriate house that they want. In which case we might wish to think through the tax pension scheme we have. So one possibility would be to raise the age of pension entitlement along with as longevity increases, not to reduce so much the welfare of older people, but because of this unintended consequence that it's squeezing younger people out of the housing market. So that would be one way of approaching it. A different way would be to go to a more save your own retirement scheme. Now that could be compulsory, as it is in many overseas countries, or voluntary. New
Zealand is quite unusual in this way, in that we have a pay-as-you-go pension scheme without any sort of compulsory saving scheme or that sort of thing.
Right. Pay-as-you-go is relatively common overseas as well, but it has a larger save-as-you-go compulsory savings aspect. Now, the advantage of this is that they could be structured so that your first few years of compulsory retirement savings could perhaps be used to as a deposit on a house, and so alleviate those credit constraints that are really the binding constraint on younger people wanting to get into housing. So that's one aspect of rethinking the pension and tax system to try and make sure that it doesn't have unintended consequences on younger people. The other aspect is to make sure that our tax system is far more neutral towards the types of savings products that we choose. And the Henry Review in Australia has come to a very similar conclusion recently. They've documented how their tax system, and in some sense our tax system as well, really penalises people who lend money rather than buy equities, and it subsidises people who borrow to invest in residential property or equities. And it may be that we really should think seriously about why we're penalising lending. I find this really bizarre in some sense. There's been a lot of calls to save more, yet by far the simplest and easiest savings product, a term deposit at a bank or government stock or a bond, but lending money is the most heavily taxed saving product in New Zealand. This really biases what I'll call unsophisticated investors, but it also biases against older investors who may want the security of a term deposit rather than the riskiness of an equity, because they're lending money and paying much higher effective tax rates than anybody else in the economy who's a saver.
Because there is the tax on the inflation component of your return.
That's right. You pay tax on the 7% even though inflation is eating away at the capital. And that just seems, well, it seems silly in some sense. Most economists would agree with me with this, going all the way back to some of the famous economists, including Irving Fisher and Modigliani. And
just finally, the one thing I love about the Motu papers is that they always come with a summary haiku. And this was a great way, I think, to summarise the paper. The young pay taxes, so the old live in mansions they wanted when young. Andrew Coleman, thank you very much from Motu. That's been another double shot interview with interest.co.nz.
Thanks very much, Bernard.
Cheers.